Racial double standards and public confrontations are deeply rooted in historical power dynamics, social conditioning, and systemic bias. These double standards often manifest in how different races are perceived, treated, and judged in similar situations, especially in moments of conflict or confrontation. The incident involving a white woman slapping a black man at a gas station and her subsequent shock when he responded highlights the pervasive and unequal ways society interprets aggression, victimhood, and justice based on race. From a young age, individuals in many societies are subtly taught to associate certain behaviors and traits with specific racial groups. White individuals, particularly women, are often framed as fragile, innocent, and in need of protection. Conversely, black individuals, especially men, are frequently portrayed as threatening, aggressive, or dangerous, even when they are the victims or acting in self-defense. This ingrained bias shapes how bystanders, media, and law enforcement interpret and react to incidents involving interracial conflict. In the gas station scenario, the white woman's action, slapping a black man, was an act of physical aggression. Objectively, it was an unprovoked assault. However, the shock she expressed when he responded in kind wasn't merely personal disbelief. It was a reflection of societal programming. She likely expected that her status, as a white woman, would shield her from retaliation or consequence. In her mind, she may not have imagined the possibility that the man she attacked would respond physically, even though his response mirrored her own action. This expectation isn't unique to her. It is part of a broader societal norm that often excuses or downplays the aggression of white individuals while magnifying or condemning the same behavior in black individuals. This disparity becomes more apparent when considering how these situations are covered in the media or judged in courtrooms. If the roles were reversed, if a black man slapped a white woman unprovoked, there is a high likelihood that the narrative would focus on his violence, her vulnerability, and the need for justice. The response from the public and authorities would be swift and severe. Headlines might label him as a thug or a menace, while her pain would be highlighted with emotional interviews and supportive commentary. However, when a white woman is the aggressor, the tone often shifts. Media may question what led her to act out, describe her actions as out of character, or even frame her as a victim if she suffers any retaliation. This lopsided interpretation of events reflects a racial double standard that persists in both subtle and overt ways. There is also the legal component. Black individuals are statistically more likely to be arrested, charged, and receive harsher sentences than white individuals for the same or lesser offenses. In public altercations, black men are frequently assumed to be at fault, regardless of evidence or context. This places them in a position where defending themselves can lead to criminal charges or public condemnation, even when their actions are clearly in response to aggression. The fear of being perceived as violent or dangerous often forces black men to de-escalate or remove themselves from situations where others might freely respond or retaliate. This burden of restraint is not equally expected or demanded across racial lines. Public perception plays a massive role in how these scenarios unfold. Witnesses to such an event may unconsciously interpret the white woman's slap as a moment of emotional outburst or a non-threatening gesture, while the black man's response might be seen as an escalation. Even when the actions are equivalent, the reactions they provoke are not. This skewed lens contributes to a system where people are not judged by their actions alone, but by the racialized assumptions attached to their identity. Additionally, the incident reflects how certain individuals expect impunity based on their social identity. The white woman's shock wasn't just at being hit. It was at being held accountable in a way she may have never experienced before. Her sense of security likely stemmed from a lifetime of implicit and explicit messaging that her race and gender granted her protection. When that unspoken contract was broken, when the black man responded, her worldview was challenged. This moment underscores how deep and often invisible these societal expectations run. Ultimately, the double standard in racialized public confrontations isn't just about who hits or who responds. It's about who is believed, who is protected, who is vilified, and who is expected to endure. It's about a system that routinely asks black individuals to operate under a stricter code of conduct while giving others the benefit of the doubt. Historically, The image of the fragile white woman was deliberately constructed to uphold systems of white supremacy and patriarchal control. During slavery and throughout the Jim Crow era, white women were positioned as the ultimate symbols of virtue and purity. This image justified brutal violence against black men who were falsely accused of threatening or disrespecting white women. Entire communities were terrorized under the pretense of defending white womanhood. The consequences of these lies were often deadly. Lynchings, false imprisonments, and social ostracization were frequent outcomes of a myth that cast black men as predatory and white women as defenseless victims. In modern times, this trope has evolved but remains deeply embedded in societal attitudes. White women are still often seen as less culpable, more innocent, and more emotionally vulnerable than their counterparts of other races. Their actions, especially in confrontational or violent situations, are frequently excused or minimized. When a white woman lashes out, it's often framed as a moment of emotional breakdown, a reaction to stress, or an uncharacteristic slip. The same behavior by a black woman or man, however, is more likely to be labeled as aggressive, dangerous, or criminal. This imbalance reveals the persistence of racialized gender norms that continue to privilege white femininity. The gas station incident, in which a white woman slaps a black man and is then shocked when he responds, is a clear example of this myth in action. Her decision to slap him suggests a sense of impunity, an expectation that she would not be held accountable and that he would not dare respond. Her shock at his retaliation reveals how deeply she believed in the protective shield of her whiteness and femininity. She did not expect consequences because she assumed the social order would protect her. This entitlement is a direct result of the fragile white woman narrative, which teaches society to sympathize with her even when she is the aggressor. This myth does not operate in isolation. It is reinforced through media, education, and everyday interactions. In film and television, white women are often portrayed as damsels in distress, as victims of circumstance, or as heroines whose emotional pain drives the narrative. Rarely are they shown as aggressors or as individuals capable of cruelty or violence without being heavily justified. This media portrayal conditions the public to see white women through a forgiving lens. When they commit acts of aggression, viewers often search for explanations that preserve the image of innocence, rather than confronting the reality of their behavior. Social media has added another layer to this dynamic. Viral videos of white women calling the police on black individuals for harmless activities, often dubbed Karens, have brought widespread attention to how the myth of fragility is weaponized. These women often use their perceived vulnerability to escalate situations, knowing that their call will likely be taken seriously by authorities. Their performative fear is not just an emotional response. It is a calculated use of societal bias to assert control. When confronted, they often cry or claim victimhood, shifting the narrative back to one where they are in need of sympathy, despite having initiated the conflict. The consequences of this myth are not limited to individual interactions. In legal and institutional contexts, white women benefit from assumptions about their character, intentions, and credibility. Studies show that white women receive lighter sentences for similar crimes compared to people of color, and their testimonies are more likely to be believed in court. This disparity reflects how the fragile white woman stereotype operates within systems of power, offering protection and leniency based on identity rather than facts. Furthermore, this myth can silence or discredit the voices of those harmed by white women's actions. When victims are not seen as sympathetic or credible, especially if they are black men or women, their pain is dismissed and their experiences are minimized. The narrative focuses on the discomfort or distress of the white woman, regardless of her role in the conflict. This distortion perpetuates a cycle where white women are rarely held accountable, and those who challenge them are vilified. The fragility myth also puts white women themselves in a restricted position, though the privilege it offers often outweighs its limitations. While it grants social protection, it also confines white women to roles of emotional instability and passivity, undermining their agency. However, the broader harm is disproportionately inflicted on communities of color, who bear the consequences of a system that prioritizes the image of white innocence over truth and justice. The consequences of unchecked entitlement are far-reaching and deeply embedded in both personal interactions and systemic structures. Entitlement, especially when connected to race, gender, or class, creates a dangerous belief that certain individuals are above accountability, that their actions are always justifiable, and that others must accommodate their behavior regardless of harm. When entitlement goes unchallenged, it can manifest in violence, manipulation, and control, often at the expense of those already marginalized or vulnerable. In situations like the gas station incident, where a white woman slaps a black man and is shocked when he retaliates, the underlying issue is not only the physical act, but the entitlement that made her believe she could act without facing consequences. Entitlement often begins as a subtle internal narrative, shaped by years of privilege and reinforced by cultural messages. A person who has consistently been given the benefit of the doubt, who has seen people like themselves centered in stories of innocence and heroism, and who has rarely been held accountable for harmful behavior, begins to internalize the belief that they are always right, always justified, and always protected. This mindset allows individuals to act out, to cross boundaries, to harm others, all while expecting to be understood, forgiven, or excused. In racial dynamics, this becomes even more pronounced when white individuals feel entitled to control a space or dominate an interaction, particularly when the other person is black. In the incident at the gas station, the white woman's decision to slap the black man likely came from a place of assumed dominance. Whether she was angry, impatient, or simply irritated, she believed she had the right to physically express her frustration. That belief did not exist in a vacuum. It was born from a lifetime of social conditioning that told her her emotions mattered more than others, that she could assert herself without fear of serious repercussions, and that society would back her up. This entitlement was so deeply rooted that it did not occur to her that the man she struck might respond in kind. Her shock was not just at being hit. It was at the crumbling of a worldview in which she was untouchable. Unchecked entitlement like this can escalate everyday tensions into major incidents. It pushes people to behave in ways that ignore the humanity and dignity of others. It leads to abuses of power in workplaces, schools, public spaces, and homes. People who believe they are entitled to speak over others, to dominate conversations, to interrupt, to invade personal space, to dictate rules they don't follow themselves, and to be treated with deference no matter how they act, are often the ones who cause lasting harm. When challenged, their response is frequently disbelief, outrage, or playing the victim. This reaction serves to deflect responsibility and further disempower the person who dared to confront them. One of the most damaging effects of unchecked entitlement is its ability to warp the narrative around justice and fairness. When entitled individuals face consequences, they often perceive it as persecution. The white woman at the gas station may have felt victimized not because she was innocent, but because she was unaccustomed to being held accountable. Her entitlement framed the man's response as inappropriate not because it truly was, but because it disrupted the power dynamic she had grown to expect. This reversal of roles, where the aggressor claims to be the victim, is a hallmark of entitled behavior and is often weaponized to avoid responsibility. Another layer to this issue is the institutional support that entitled individuals often receive. When society consistently validates their perspective, excuses their behavior, and punishes those who stand up to them, the entitlement is reinforced. This can be seen in how authorities respond to such incidents. A black man defending himself from physical aggression may still be viewed as a threat, while the white woman who initiated the violence might be treated as someone who made a mistake or acted out of emotion. This discrepancy is not accidental. It is part of a larger system that allows entitlement to thrive unchecked among those in privileged positions. The psychological toll of encountering entitled behavior, especially for those on the receiving end, is significant. It creates environments of fear, exhaustion, and silence. People learn to avoid confrontation, to stay quiet, to shrink themselves in order to avoid triggering a response from someone who feels entitled to control the situation. This imbalance affects workplace dynamics, community interactions, and even personal relationships. When someone always expects to be in charge, and others are expected to submit or tolerate their behavior, real harm occurs, both emotionally and socially. Unchecked entitlement also stifles growth. It prevents individuals from reflecting on their actions, learning from their mistakes, or understanding the impact they have on others. When people are always told they are right, they stop questioning themselves. They stop listening. They stop evolving. This stagnation does not just affect them. It affects everyone around them, especially those who are constantly asked to absorb the consequences of their unchecked behavior. Media bias in framing violence and self-defense plays a crucial role in shaping public perception, reinforcing stereotypes, and influencing outcomes in both legal and social contexts. The way a story is told, what details are included, whose voice is amplified, and what language is used, can dramatically alter how audiences understand a situation. When it comes to incidents involving race, particularly those in which a Black individual defends themselves against aggression from a white person, media outlets often distort the narrative in ways that criminalize the defender and excuse or minimize the aggressor. This bias is not always overt, but it is persistent, and its effects are powerful. One of the most common techniques used by biased media coverage is selective storytelling. In a confrontation, especially one involving physical violence, reporters often frame the incident around the reactions of the individuals rather than the cause. For example, in the case of a white woman slapping a Black man and him retaliating, headlines might focus on the fact that he hit a woman rather than on the fact that he was physically assaulted first. By foregrounding his response and downplaying or even omitting her initial aggression, the media skews public understanding and fosters a narrative in which he becomes the aggressor and she becomes the victim. This imbalance is not accidental. It reflects a broader societal bias that treats Black self-defense as aggression and white aggression as a mistake or emotional outburst. Language choice is another powerful tool used to subtly shape bias. When white individuals commit violent or inappropriate acts, they are often described with humanizing terms. Words like troubled, emotional, or misunderstood appear in coverage, and their actions are often contextualized with background details about their stress, mental health, or difficult day. Meanwhile, Black individuals in the same situations are frequently stripped of nuance and portrayed as threats. Descriptions like aggressive, angry, or uncooperative are used, regardless of whether they were reacting defensively or simply asserting their boundaries. These word choices create starkly different emotional responses in readers and viewers, shaping who is seen as sympathetic and who is seen as dangerous. Images also play a key role in media framing. The photos chosen to accompany a news story can reinforce stereotypes or challenge them, depending on editorial decisions. In many high-profile cases, white individuals accused of violence are shown in flattering or neutral images, smiling family portraits, graduation photos, or casual selfies. In contrast, Black individuals, even when they are victims or acting in self-defense, are often shown in mugshots, grainy surveillance footage, or images that suggest criminality. This visual bias reinforces preconceived notions and subtly informs audiences about who deserves empathy and who does not. Beyond individual news stories, the overall pattern of coverage contributes to a public narrative in which Black people are disproportionately associated with crime and violence, even though data does not support such a broad generalization. This distorted media landscape influences how people interpret real-life events. When viewers see a video of a Black man defending himself against a physical attack by a white woman, their perception of who is right and who is wrong is filtered through years of biased storytelling. They may instinctively question his motives, doubt his version of events, or assume he escalated the situation, even when the evidence shows otherwise. Media bias also extends to which stories get covered in the first place. Incidents where white individuals are aggressors and people of color are victims are often underreported or ignored unless there is viral video footage or widespread public outcry. On the other hand, stories that fit the stereotype of the Black aggressor are more likely to be picked up, amplified, and repeated. This disproportionate coverage creates a skewed reality in which certain groups appear to commit more violence simply because their stories are told more often and more dramatically. This systemic problem is compounded by the fact that many newsrooms lack diversity, both in their staff and in their editorial leadership. Without a variety of perspectives in decision-making roles, stories continue to be shaped by the biases and blind spots of a narrow demographic. Journalists may not intentionally set out to distort the truth, but if they operate within a system that normalizes biased framing, the results are the same. The consequences affect public opinion, jury decisions, policy discussions, and everyday social interactions. The framing of violence and self-defense in the media does not just misrepresent facts. It influences who gets justice and who does not. When Black individuals are consistently portrayed as aggressors, they are more likely to be arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. When white individuals are consistently portrayed as emotionally overwhelmed or morally justified, they are more likely to be seen as victims or deserving of leniency. This disparity reflects and reinforces broader societal inequities, and it allows cycles of injustice to continue largely unchallenged. The historical context of race and gender dynamics is essential to understanding the deeper significance of interactions like the one between a white woman and a Black man at a gas station, where she initiates physical aggression and is shocked when he defends himself. This moment cannot be fully understood without looking at the long, violent, and deeply unequal history of how race and gender have intersected in Western societies, particularly in the United States. These dynamics were not created in isolation. They were constructed and maintained to uphold systems of dominance and control, shaping perceptions, behaviors, and institutional responses across generations. Dating back to slavery, Black men and women were positioned at the bottom of a rigid racial hierarchy. Enslaved Black men were dehumanized and portrayed as inherently violent, physically powerful, and sexually aggressive. These stereotypes were intentionally spread to justify brutal control and surveillance. The myth of the dangerous Black man served as a rationale for the extreme violence of slave patrols, lynchings, and later, aggressive policing. It also created a false narrative that white women needed protection from Black men, even though it was Black women who suffered most from sexual violence and exploitation during slavery, often at the hands of white men. At the same time, white women were idealized as symbols of purity, virtue, and fragility. This image was used to justify their exclusion from the public and political spheres, while also elevating them above women of color in the racial hierarchy. The trope of the white woman as the ultimate victim became a powerful tool in the social order. If a white woman accused a Black man of inappropriate behavior, society often responded with immediate and brutal retaliation, regardless of the truth. The most infamous examples are the numerous lynchings that occurred based on false or unproven accusations by white women against Black men. These acts of racial terror were socially sanctioned and rarely punished, cementing a power structure where white women's words carried life and death consequences for Black men. Even after the abolition of slavery, these narratives endured and evolved. During the Jim Crow era, laws and customs rigidly enforced segregation and punished any perceived crossing of racial boundaries, especially those involving Black men and white women. Black men were taught to avoid even looking at white women, because a glance could be misinterpreted as a threat. Meanwhile, white women were taught to see themselves as naturally superior and deserving of deference, particularly from people of color. These social codes were passed down through generations, becoming ingrained in everyday interactions, media portrayals, and legal systems. The civil rights movement began to challenge these power structures, but the underlying stereotypes remained. Black men continued to be portrayed in media as violent or hypermasculine, while white women were still seen as gentle and morally upright. These portrayals fed into unequal treatment in schools, workplaces, courts, and public life. When a white woman and a Black man come into conflict, even today, the response is often colored by this long history. The white woman is more likely to be believed, to be comforted, and to be treated as the aggrieved party. The Black man is more likely to be scrutinized, disciplined, or criminalized. This imbalance is not just about individual prejudice. It is embedded in the very structures of society. In the legal system, for example, Black men are more likely to be charged with crimes, receive longer sentences, and be denied bail than white defendants accused of the same offenses. Meanwhile, white women, especially those who conform to traditional standards of femininity, often receive more lenient treatment. These disparities are a direct legacy of the racial and gender hierarchies that were established centuries ago and have been carefully maintained through law, policy, and culture. The interaction at the gas station is not an isolated event. It is a moment that reflects these larger patterns. The white woman's expectation that she could physically strike a black man and face no consequences stems from a long history of racial and gender privilege. Her shock at his response reveals the enduring assumption that black men must be passive in the face of white aggression. The public's reaction, too, is shaped by these dynamics. Some may instinctively see her as the victim, even if she was the one who started the conflict. Others may view the black man's act of self-defense as a threat, because it challenges deeply held ideas about who is allowed to express anger, assert boundaries, or fight back. Understanding the historical context of race and gender dynamics is essential because it reveals how much of what appears to be individual behavior is actually rooted in collective memory and systemic conditioning. The power imbalances seen in moments like this one are not accidental. They are the result of centuries of social engineering designed to protect the interests of some while controlling others. This legacy continues to affect everything from interpersonal relationships to public policy, creating an environment in which true equality remains elusive. Why accountability must apply to everyone equally is not just a moral argument. It is a foundational requirement for a just and functional society. When accountability is selective, determined by factors such as race, gender, or social status, the very concept of justice becomes hollow. The moment a society begins to excuse or rationalize the harmful behavior of some while punishing others for the same or lesser actions, it signals a dangerous double standard that undermines public trust, social harmony, and individual dignity. Incidents like the one where a white woman slaps a black man and is shocked when he hits back are not just about personal conflict. They are mirrors reflecting deeper systemic failures to apply accountability fairly. The idea that everyone should be held responsible for their actions is often preached but rarely practiced evenly. For some, accountability means facing real consequences, legal, social, or professional. For others, it is diluted by privilege, excused by context, or redirected into sympathy. In the gas station scenario, the white woman felt justified in slapping the black man, likely expecting that she would face no repercussions. Her shock at his response suggests she believed her identity would shield her from any form of accountability, including immediate personal consequences. This expectation did not arise in isolation. It was built from years of seeing similar behavior overlooked, excused, or even rewarded. When accountability is not equally enforced, it sends a message to both victims and aggressors. To the aggressors, especially those in privileged positions, it says, you can get away with it. You can act out, hurt others, cross boundaries, and still be protected. To the victims, particularly those from marginalized communities, it says, your pain does not matter. Your safety is secondary. Your voice will not be heard. Over time, this imbalance breeds resentment, fear, and hopelessness. It tells people that the system is not there to protect them, but to preserve the power of those already advantaged. The consequences of unequal accountability extend beyond individual incidents. They shape institutional behavior. Law enforcement officers, educators, employers, and judges often internalize these societal patterns. Studies show that Black individuals are more likely to be disciplined harshly in schools, denied fair treatment in the workplace, and given longer sentences in court. Meanwhile, white individuals in similar circumstances are often offered leniency, understanding, or alternatives to punishment. This discrepancy does not arise from objective differences in behavior. It stems from unequal expectations around who should be accountable and who deserves forgiveness. Unequal accountability also perpetuates harmful stereotypes. When white people, especially white women, are shielded from consequences, it reinforces the idea that they are inherently good, incapable of malice, or simply victims of circumstance. When Black people are punished swiftly and severely, it reinforces the myth of inherent aggression, criminality, or lack of self-control. These stereotypes feed into every aspect of society, from media representation to public policy, continuing the cycle of injustice. They also put an unfair emotional and psychological burden on Black individuals, who are constantly navigating a world where they are expected to be perfect victims or risk being labeled as the problem. True accountability must be consistent and impartial. It must be rooted in actions, not identities. If a person commits an act of violence, their race or gender should not determine whether they are held responsible. If someone causes harm, their social status should not shield them from consequence. This principle must apply not only in law enforcement or the courtroom, but in everyday interactions, schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and public spaces. It must guide how we interpret videos, how we share stories, and how we respond when someone is called out for harm. Applying accountability equally is not about revenge or punishment. It is about fairness and balance. It is about acknowledging that every person has the capacity to do harm, and that harm must be addressed regardless of who causes it. It is also about recognizing that everyone deserves the right to defend themselves when harmed, without fear that their identity will be used against them. When a black man defends himself against aggression from a white woman, he should not be condemned for asserting his right to safety. If she is the one who initiated violence, she must face the consequences, not be recast as the victim because of her race or gender. Building a culture of equal accountability requires courage and commitment. It means challenging long-standing assumptions, questioning biased narratives, and refusing to let identity override truth. It requires institutions to examine their practices, communities to confront their biases, and individuals to hold themselves and others to consistent standards. It means teaching children that fairness matters more than favoritism, and that actions carry consequences no matter who you are. Only when accountability applies to everyone equally can justice be more than an ideal. It can become a lived reality.